Right. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, this is working still.
Shall I put you on?
Good. Shall we start then? Even while John is getting his coffee and coming to sit down. So those who are watching online, if you can hear me okay, that would be great, because we've been having big hassles with the microphones this evening. So you can text Anne to let her know. That would be fantastic. Good. Well, should we get straight into it now?
Yes.
Now that
Yeah.
John has sat down, I'm sure you hate being the centre of attention, and the whole world is watching those that we were waiting for each. So,
But they're not on camera.
yeah. So Father, we just we do thank you for the time we've got, and you know the funny thing is with the different technologies, it does feel like a community with people WhatsApping to say they're here and so on, and so Jesus, just pray that this is a productive time tonight. Pray that there are new insights. I know certainly I've had them while I was preparing it. Lord Jesus, just pray that everyone will go, oh, that's interesting. I've not seen that before, and that feeds the soul in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So we're continuing as we run through the Sermon on the Mount. As I said, I kind of keep saying it, but it's just true every week. You know, I spend. If you consider the size and the numbers that we get initially to these first off, because these are always first times of kind of often delivering a presentation or whatever, you think, oh, what, you know, all the effort that goes into it. But actually, from my point of view, it really beds down, you know. And actually, I find just the whole process of not just thinking it through fresh, but also producing new slides that makes you think a little bit more deeply about what you're presenting. So for me, it's a real pleasure. It's really good, and I've enjoyed again this week. So 2 weeks ago, because we cancelled last week, you know, I was thinking, oh look, we're coming to week 3, and you know, Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart." I've just realised at some point I've got, for some reason, when I was doing the slides today, which now it's too late, I put the peacemakers. It's not the peacemakers, it's the pure in heart. It just began with P. So I wasn't thinking properly. Blessed are the pure in heart, and as I said, in the way that the Sermon on the Mount kind of expounds those initial blessings, actually we only have a very small number of verses that it kind of unpacks to, and I remember as I was kind of first sat down thinking, I was thinking, oh, maybe I did it wrong, maybe I should have bundled a couple of them together because there's a kind of a nice flow between them and so on. But actually, I had to kind of contain myself as the number of potential slides for tonight kept on growing, and I thought, well, we only have a certain amount of time, and so on and so forth, and it's just one of those incredibly. It really brought home to me, in many ways, how the Sermon on the Mount is, if you like, the distilled teaching of Jesus. So it's a bit like, you know, a really strong kind of spirit. You know, you need to kind of mix it with water, that actually, although it's a very simple kind of couple of statements that Jesus makes about pure in heart, the work of modern psychology, I just kept getting reminded of new things from it, if you see what I mean. And so it'd be very easy, and I've probably done this myself, as you're driving through saying, oh well, you know, because he says don't commit adultery, but if you're looking on somebody lustfully, well, let's just talk about your inner thought life and keep it under order, take every thought captive, get the mind of Christ, that kind of thing. You can run through that in a couple of minutes. But as I was kind of pulling it together and realising it in the context of last week and so on, and the flow, I just thought, well, actually it triggers this and it triggers that. So we'll go all over the place, and it'd be very easy to kind of say, well, Jesus doesn't actually say that. But actually, you know, John says, doesn't he, at the end of his gospel, he said, if you wrote down everything Jesus said and taught, that the whole world wouldn't contain the books. And so there's an interesting tension in that, because it's almost as if by our engagement with the Holy Spirit, the expectation is that if we're given the distilled version, we should be able to try and start to feel our way forward out into that kind of bigger sense of what Jesus may have said. Does that make sense? And I actually think, well, the fact that God has arranged it that way is probably because that's the only way it gets into us. You know, if we had a lot more of what Jesus actually wrote about these things, or said about these things, not wrote. You know, if we had written down exactly everything Jesus taught on marriage and the inner life and so on, because Jesus only talks about marriage on a handful of occasions. To put it in context, almost no other philosopher really writes about marriage in a positive way anywhere in history. Buddha thinks it's a bad idea. Seneca, all of the Romans and the Greeks, Plato, for instance. Well, you just don't want to go there in terms of what Plato thinks of marriage. He actually sees it as a backward step, just to kind of put it in context. So he thought that the love of a young boy was a pure step, but marriage was a kind of a degradation because it made us more like animals who just have sex to procreate. Whereas when I'm with my young lad, it's not about procreation, it's just about beauty. That's his logic. So that's the usual way that the philosophers think about it. And so the fact that Jesus says that anything at all is unique, if I can put it that way. The fact he doesn't say very much is because he said so much on so many things, but he says enough, and in the tensions of it, and we work it back through the Old Testament and the nuances and the bits he captures from the Old Testament, we can start to see a whole network and framework of thinking that starts to emerge. So we'll see some of that tonight, and hopefully that will be kind of interesting as we run through. So we're going to unpack the blessing, blessed are the pure in heart because they shall see God. And even that kind of single phrase has a tension in it, as we'll see. That pure in heart, this is Soren Kierkegaard, who wrote purity of heart is to will one thing. It's a kind of an interesting little kind of tension. Obviously he was a Christian in a more of that more existential liberal persuasion, but wrote very eloquently. And kind of it's quite a nice little definition that purity of heart is willing and desiring. Just he kind of makes the two together. That willing, desiring, seeking after something. And so to desire God, you get to see God. If your desire is for him, blessed are the pure in heart. If those who are pure in heart, purity of heart is willing, desiring it, you wanting to see him. But if you're going to look elsewhere for desire's sake, if you like, if you let your desires go elsewhere, then you do sort of lose sight of God. It's all kind of there in the tension. And so in one sense, just this simple little kind of statement, which we're going to unpack and see how it relates to relationships and to marriage and all sorts of other things. There's this kind of tension in it. There's something about what is the ultimate aim of our desire. Because it's an interesting contrast, you know. It's not kind of, well, you can desire a cupcake, you can desire sex, and you can desire God, and it's the balance of which one's the biggest. But there's this kind of sense of where is it ultimately? What is it fundamentally you're looking for? And there seems to be, you know, in Jesus' promise is that actually we stay single-minded in it, we don't get distracted. And I find that quite useful because in that sense it puts, as we're going to see, a kind of an outside of, if you see your, if you're putting kind of your carnal, your sexual desires into the context of finding God, we're looking for the framework that God sets. So we're not doing like the Greeks did, which is let's shove it all away, or like Buddha does, that we don't want to have anything to do with it, if you see what I mean. Now there are plenty, of course, Christian thinkers in the church who've taken the same view, like Augustine. So Augustine definitely thought the celibate life was the best life, but that was first of all having lived a very wayward life as a young man. It was kind of like once he was bored of the situation, he then kind of advocated abstinence on everybody else. But actually that's not the context that we have, as we're going to see. There is a framework whereby actually the two can come in line. So we're ultimately desiring God through the way we express our sexuality, rather than trying to repress it and kind of cut it off. So I'm going to I'm just kind of reminding us some things as we're kind of going through. Remember we looked in the first week around the kind of the dimensions that have been pulled out by the moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who kind of talks about the three different areas, and I've highlighted in particular the sanctity, because he describes that actions through the, if you look at all the way around the world, the West only judges things in terms of that little box of autonomy, that circle of autonomy. So if it affects the individual, then it's bad or good, how it affects the individual. Whereas most of the world, well, the huge majority of the world actually see a much richer kind of layers. They also would see actions that potentially damage community, which is why most of the world does see adultery as bad. But in the Western world, well, if it's consensual between two adults, too bad, you know, she just fell out of love with her husband. It's all okay because the individuals are not hurting each other. But most of the world would say actually, but family is the building block of our communities, and actually families get damaged, and actually it's not the fact that it was consensual has nothing to do with whether it's good or bad. And then they tend to have a sanctity dimension, And he highlights that even although they come down to different conclusions, although the West doesn't think it thinks like this, it does still need these things. And if it needs to be deliberate in trying to find them. And he talks about the West, he's talking about kind of the West that has abandoned God, if you think, rather than necessarily as Christians. Because in this line, actually, you do get this. There's something about the sanctity dimension, because when he looks at it, at the very top you have God, and what is it you're pursuing? Spiritual meaning and purpose. And normally down the line there is actually how do you treat your body in terms of what you eat, and also how you express yourself and do things sexually. And so these are things that very definitely, what Jesus is in one sense touching on, is this sanctity dimension. That blessed are the pure in heart, because they will see God. Well, that's right at the top, but actually when he unpacks it, it's well, if you're looking on people, you know you're not supposed to commit adultery, that's the purity thing, but actually there's an inner life that kind of goes with it, and actually those things classically sit within that sanctity dimension of morality that most of the world recognises, but in the West we increasingly find difficult to get our kind of heads around. This is a quote from a chapter. He asked the question of, can you have divinity without God? We have a different conclusion in our minds. but he has this quote that he's from a Chinese philosopher, Meng Tzu. We mustn't allow the ignoble to injure the world, or the smaller to injure the greater. Those who nourish the smaller parts will become small men. Those who nourish the greater will become greater men. So what he's saying is that sanctity dimension is so important, because it's the very thing that drags people, if you like, out of their animal behaviours to more what they might think of as higher calling and human behaviours. If you think of it in the kind of biblical terms, he's made us a little lower than the angels. So the angels are kind of pure and up there. They don't have our physical nature, but there's something in us that combines both the animal, because Genesis 1 makes the cows from the dust of the earth. He makes humanity from the dust of the earth. We share some physicality with everything. With most of the higher order social creation, we're made of the same stuff. We even have some of the same history in the making. And then it's into that context that God breathes his breath. So we kind of combine both the kind of the fleshly animalistic, but also something that wants to reach higher. And actually part of the way we grow higher is by keeping that perspective and seeing God. Those who want to see God, the desire to see God. And so he kind of he's just illustrating this dimension with this quote, that there is a kind of a way of seeing the world where you can look at an action which may not obviously seem to hurt an individual, but does it somehow make the person themselves more animal-like? Does it make them smaller? Does it make them less noble, if I can put it that way? That whole dimension brings about nobility. It's what creates, in many ways, civilization. Even in their misgivings and their failures, but by seeking after God, is the way in which humanity kind of lifts itself. And once we start to celebrate going backwards, which is what a lot of our culture does nowadays, then you're in trouble. And it's harder to have a conversation with people who kind of have got to that sort of. There is I remember when we first got digital TV, there's the music channel that the kids would come in and turn on, and there was a song that used to be on it. I can't remember who the band was, but the lyric was, "When it comes to it, we ain't nothing but mammals, so let's do it like they do on the Discovery Channel," you see. And you just think, well, this message that they're giving our kids is, well, we're just animals, so who cares? Don't get told by your parents or your school, that's the kind of the way it goes. And so you put sexuality, if you like, as it drags downwards, it has an incredible power to either work with it, you define it, and it kind of lifts you up, or you just go with the flow, at which point it takes us down, if I can put it that way. And I think to some degree that's I think that's kind of there in that very clear kind of statement. Pure in heart, they do get to see God. It's part of the upward call that ultimately desire is focused on the Lord or on something spiritual, but within that there is a place for the fact that we do have a human nature, an animal nature. We do share a physicality with the world around us, and we're not going to ignore that like the Eastern philosophers do. we're going to actually make it serve the greater end. And that theme actually kind of you can find right the way through from the Old Testament, right the way through Scripture. That same sort of idea. I can't remember how I put the slides together now. So if you kind of now put, so we're going to explore a little bit tonight the kind of the relationship between agape, which is, if you like, love in its pure sense, and eros, which is the kind of the carnal side, using the Greek words, not necessarily biblically, but it's interesting that even at the highest level, love of God is also kind of presented now as the marriage of Christ and His church. You see, so there is actually, so it's not, if you in Judaic Christian thinking, there is something of that in it that is good, that if we see it correctly, actually is uplifting, whereas when we see it wrongly, it drags us down. So you can kind of get what I'm driving at, I think, is that we're not an either or, although unfortunately an awful lot of church history we've gone the same way the rest of the world does, which is it just seems too destructive. Let's just now, the pure life is to ignore it. Although it's got nothing to do with the slides I've got here, I always have a great kind of sympathy for Abelard, who was a theologian and philosopher, who fell in love with a young girl, but because he was committed to being a philosopher, he wasn't allowed to marry her, but he wanted to. So he then asked her ward, who was her uncle, if he could. He thought it was so outrageous that a Christian philosopher should want to kind of get involved physically with someone. It would be a kind of a total, he would definitely be on his way to hell for that. But he ignored that advice, and they eloped together. He got tracked down by her uncle, who then castrated him, obviously for spiritual reasons. But as a result, he writes some incredibly beautiful, I say as a result, but part of his whole journey, he writes some beautiful things about the nature of love. And yet, in the middle of all of that was what, at one level, you can see as quite a, you could look at as just a purely kind of lust-driven thing, but actually there is something even in that process that he found that gave him an understanding of the passion of God. And it's interesting, we talk about the passion of Christ, because the word passion is about motivation that gets painful, if I can put it that way. And the reason we use passion for love is because love is a passion that gets painful. It doesn't all just have to be about sexual release. There's something very intense in some of those early stages of it, as we'll think about kind of tonight. So I put this little kind of, it's shunned by most religious and philosophical systems, but it's foundationally biblical, is the idea that there's something, if you think about the book of the Song of Solomon, which we get out and very piously on church will say, well, really it's about the love of Christ for His church, which is true, but it's also a very kind of erotic poem. But it's an appropriately erotic one. It's not an inappropriately, if I put it that way. Those kind of comments like where the groom is putting his hand around the bedroom door, but they're not yet married. It's the night before they're married, and so he goes away, and she's waiting the other side, and she's kind of was whether he's going to come in or not. All of these things. They at one level they kind of would be very. I wouldn't say they're inappropriate because they're biblical, but they could feel that way, if I can put it that way. They could feel it that way if you did it. But because God is almost like God is saying, I can't wait, and so this is seeing as I've got a lot to do and I've only done about 2 slides. I'm definitely getting sidetracked here. But I suppose what I'm trying to get across is I find it fascinating how much our spirituality endorses our humanity. Let's put it that way. That a proper Christian spirituality endorses things about our humanity that when we've somehow lost the truth of it, we get a bit funny about and we try and ignore. Does that make sense? But actually that's what most religions do at the end of the day. Let's say religions that are looking to climb up to a God who's not kind of pagan, who takes them down further. That's another story. So anyway, I put there, in fact it turns out that from a psychological point of view, the higher forms of love, i.e. agape, actually are intrinsically linked to kind of the lower, much more emotive forms. One grows out of the other. So you can't actually achieve one without going through various cycles of doing properly the earlier ones. We'll explore that a little bit more. I'll explain what I mean by that. But I just want to kind of capture that in terms of where we've got to in modern psychology is actually it's by doing well what we sometimes think is a bit more animal that actually we kind of grow in our ability to express it in a much kind of pure and more abstract way. So the one kind of grows out of the other. Which is why I think, therefore, Jesus makes these statements that kind of, so don't get the flow wrong. Let's not mess up that flow, because if you're going to do this well, then you're going to have to do this well. If I can put it this way. So, going to introduce, here you go, this is a guy, Emil Durkheim, who is the founder of all sociology. He kind of invented the academic discipline. This is kind of touching on this agape thing. One of his most important works was he did a pan-European study on suicide. And in it, one of the things he established, and this is over 100 years ago, and it's basically his views have never been shaken. They not say views, his findings have never been shaken, they've just been unpacked further. Because one of the things he established is there's an inverse relationship between the strength and meaning of our personal social connections and our rates of suicide. So the weaker our personal and less of them there are of meaningful social interactions, the more likely we are to tend towards despair and die. And he established very quickly that actually there are certain styles of religious community that therefore very rarely seem to experience suicide. If I can put it that way. Interestingly, it was kind of Orthodox Jews were the best. And part of that is probably because of the tight-knitness of the fact that they were often a persecuted minority. So the more kind of the more intense the religious kind of foundation, they all were of kind of Protestant or Jewish kind of origins. There weren't anything else at the time really. But that was one of the things he tracked down. So as a result of his kind of work, which as I say has been unpacked further, there's been copious studies. Kind of tracked and confirmed how growth and quality of more general relationships develop kind of from that basic family structure, and of course, you know, putting it in kind of the rather blunt terms, you need sex to build the family structure, and you need to do it well to build the family structure. But it's out of those relationships and out of that community that the meaningful ones kind of extend themselves. So when you hear kind of arguments on TV about the family structure being so key, and people kind of almost don't want that to be the case, but they begrudgingly have to admit it. It goes right the way back to the foundations of sociology. It was one of the first kind of findings with these things. In modern terms, we would say people's well-being goes downhill when those things don't work so well. You know, so this kind of simple little statement, as we're going to see, pursuit of God, and actually putting within that, therefore, how our sexual relationships work, which is what Jesus does in his statement. Actually, we can start seeing it does have this kind of social demographic to it. So anyway, we'll just see how putting here, remember the context. This was supposed to be my first slide. Because remember, last time we were together, which is 2 weeks ago, we were looking at how the issue of slandering and speaking badly of people, we find it in the Babia Metzia, which is part of the Talmud writing. And it was kind of one of the things that was presented as being an issue that could get you stuck in Gehenna, if you remember when we looked at it. So it raises the issues of name calling and damaging someone's reputation, and next to it, adultery. But I put there in brackets not fornication, because although I haven't put the slides up, if you read on through there, the only one that gets you stuck in Gehenna was if you had an inappropriate sexual relationship with someone else's wife, and they were clearly somebody else's wife, and there was no ambiguity. If it was anything else, is okay. You know, you can just spend a bit of time in Gehenna and then you get out. Was the kind of the logic. So here you go, citing the Gemara. This is in the Talmud. Anyone who descends to Gehenna ultimately ascends. So, as I said, Gehenna is more like purgatory in their thinking, except for the three who descend and don't ascend, and these are those: one who engages in intercourse with a married woman, as this is a transgression, a serious offence against God and a person, and one who humiliates another in public and calls another by a derogatory name. So that was a kind of the context, because the fact that these two things sit next to each other in the Sermon on the Mount, I'm quite sure that because Jesus actually right the way through the sermon refers to other teachings. He says, you know, you've heard it said, you should love your neighbour, but I say to you now, love your enemy. Well, he's quoting again from the wider rabbinic teaching that we find in the Talmud. So the Sermon on the Mount doesn't sit in a vacuum. It actually sits in a connection of the kind of things that people have been hearing. And so people will have been hearing people talk about calling people names and going to Gehenna, and committing adultery and going to Gehenna, and Jesus puts the two things together in his own teaching, but he takes a slightly different kind of tone to it. So I've got my little note. So adultery and angry slander form that kind of pair that's worthy of Gehenna in the rabbinic teaching. Jesus uses that association to explore the root from the fruit, because in both situations he goes back to the kind of the inner life rather than just what you end up doing. So just as he did with, you've heard, don't commit murder and so on, but actually even as you kind of those simple little things, it's not like a big slander, which is the kind of things they would argue here, but just you fool, you moron, remember the word. So he kind of goes back to the root before the fruit. And so we're in here, how seeing God and depersonalised sex at either end of that kind of sanctity spectrum, because as I said, in one sense the idea of my body is my temple, that's why I behave well with it. So if I'm kind of a new age whatever, I may not eat bacon sandwiches because my body is a temple, but equally we're supposed to actually, how we conduct ourselves sexually is a kind of a kind of an expression of that idea, that kind of ascent towards God. So they sit at different ends, and kind of that place of family relationships, which was seen as important in Judaism, and to the credit, Jewish culture is absolutely founded around the shape of the family, because they see it as so intrinsic to the teaching of the Old Testament, which I think it's an important indictment. Probably not unsurprising in the sense of that Christian culture tends to come from a more pagan society and therefore comes in with more baggage. But actually that foundational place of family is really key there within Orthodox Jewish thinking, and Jesus knows that, and so he gets right into the heart of it, because the whole context of the kind of rabbinic teaching that I just put the quotes up from was a bit like when you're dealing in a kind of a church youth group, which is always the question of how far can I go, which is, in other words, how much am I allowed to do and what's not allowed, rather than actually how good should I be, how can I make this really work well for me. How can I do something that I won't regret in the future and really builds for life, and enhances life in the long term? Jesus' teaching, again, we've got to put it into that background context and go right the way back to Genesis 1, which I think is fascinating to see it this way. So God's just said he's made man in his image, so he's made mankind in his image, and in that context God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply and fill up the earth, which of course has an obvious sexual connotation. Genesis has been quite explicit. God has made them a them, male and female. So the genders are right in there. In the context of being made in their image, he says now part of that is about filling up the earth. So there's something in that kind of foundational relationship. And of course, Jesus, when he's asked about marriage, goes back to God's intention, which is always one man and one woman. There's a complementariness to it, and there's also an exclusivity to it. Yes, there were Jews in Jesus' day, and there were in the patriarchs who had multiple wives, and so it's not that therefore they're excluded from everything that God is doing, but they're not what the intention was of God in that process. So be fruitful and multiply, fill up the earth, which has got a kind of sex dimension, subdue it, rule over it, which you can kind of put the aggression bit, the kind of sex and aggression, which are foundationally become those kind of motives. And in one sense we've just had the two, but in the other order. Last week it was about aggression, it kind of cleverly, subtly disguised aggression, but it's still about trying to wound the other person, but just using our words, if you think about it. And now we're kind of getting down, but the kind of key thing to notice is, it doesn't get earlier than Genesis 1, really, does it? You can't go back to an earlier chapter. Because there is something very foundational in terms of, if you like, our drives, and that is a part of the humanity which you're not supposed to be trying to get away from, but we are supposed to be operating within in a way that kind of in the end leads us to God, leads us to the Lord, if I can put doing all those ways. Paul puts it this way, if you think about it, in Romans 1. So since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen. Well, that's part of Jesus' promise, isn't it? Those who are pure in heart will see God. So Paul is writing Romans 1 within in a similar framework or concept to what Jesus is kind of working through as he goes through the Sermon on the Mount, which kind of gives us a hint of things that have come to Paul, that people were there to tell us a bit more because we've distilled it for the Sermon on the Mount. But these are the kind of the ideas, and we're kind of seeing the clear kind of parallel running through. So we can see God, those things have been clearly seen, and they are seen in creation. That we see his divine nature through what was made, you see, through what was made. So through our bodies, and through the things that we find around us, and through our physicality. And that, remember, in the early days of the Christian church, Gnosticism was the big threat. And the problem with Gnosticism, its main problem, was everything was just darn spiritual. And yet that was the big problem they had with it. That's why it was an issue of, did Christ come in the flesh? Because the Gnostics were so spiritual, they couldn't believe he was really in a human body, because that was so disgusting and degraded and so whatever, that couldn't be a perfect God, couldn't live in an imperfect human body, you see. And so this idea is more than just a kind of an add-on. It's really intrinsic to the revelationary nature of our faith, which is that God became flesh, if I can put it that way. Sorry, I keep hammering home points, which I'm probably preaching to the choir, but you know, you never know who's watching. So you know, so people are without excuse, says Paul, because although they knew God, they didn't glorify him as God or give him thanks, but they claimed to be wise and they became fools. So a little bit of a danger there. Paul is skirting on the, you know, don't call people fool. Well, Jesus isn't being absolute in it. What he's saying isn't that kind of easy flow. And they exchanged, therefore, the glory of the immortal God for an image resembling mortal humans. So we were discovering the image of God in creation through the natural order of things, through our bodies and so on, through what was made. So actually, even in my own physicality, I can discover God in those ways. But actually, the problem of the world is because they're not looking to find God anymore, you see, because they're not seeking God in their desire, if you see what I mean, they get distracted by it, and it goes to all sorts of places. So what we have very helpfully in my mind from Paul is a kind of, if you like, an exposition of the problem that Jesus was addressing. But in the Sermon on the Mount, with it nice and quickly distilled for us, we just have the kind of the headline. But actually, within that same framework, we kind of get the idea, because this verse is so relevant to the modern world. We all see it. That once you've stopped believing in the idea of there's something above us that we're trying to get to, and even if we're doing it wrong, like the people with the Tower of Babel, once we stop believing that's the case, we end up getting swamped, if you like, by a downward pull into our bestiality. I'm using that in the general sense of the word, into our physical nature, and that's what he says happens in the world. And so he gave them over to the desires of their heart, to impurity, to dishonour their bodies amongst themselves, so that the body then becomes dishonoured. And we see that time and time again through history and in modern society. So keep going on this sex and aggression thing. We've got the quote. I actually find it's a really helpful quote for understanding the secular world, which is Oscar Wilde. Everything in the world is about sex, except sex. Sex is about power. Because actually, again, you get that same idea. Sex and aggression is what you're left with when in be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion. Once you've taken God's purpose from it, once you've got God's covering out from it, all you're left with are the drives. And actually, they do everything in the world comes down to two things. In one sense, it's all about the sex, but even except for the sex. But when you get there, that's actually about power. So the two are kind of, if you like, in their fallen nature. We see it regularly. We see it all the time. It's kind of interesting. I think, I don't know if I put it on the slide. No. But just a couple of weeks ago, I was at a leaders meeting, and David Landrum from the EA was speaking, and he made the reference that the secular always becomes the sexular, you know, that one becomes the other. He said, because actually once you have removed the idea of wanting to talk to God, you've lost what you're aspiring to, and it just degenerates to what are the most powerful instincts, and that's the kind of the way it goes. Oh yeah, there we go. I've got the phrase. The secular always reduces to the sexular. That's where I got that one from. I should have quoted him, shouldn't I? I should put his name on. So coming now to actually what Jesus says. Let's start. So he goes, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I'm saying to you, whoever looks at a woman to desire her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So we notice what Jesus does say, but also let's notice what he doesn't say. because I found this quite helpful, because I remember I used to have a problem with this verse because it's if you ever see the pain that's caused by divorce, by adultery, and you're thinking, well, it is a lot worse, but Jesus doesn't say he doesn't say that they're equivalent. He's actually kind of taking the whole thing. You know you're not supposed to do this out here, but I want to push this further in. I want to go right back to the roots. So he's actually, so I say to you, whoever's now looking, desire, you're already, and you say, well, can anybody ever live up to that standard? You know, we can be pious and say, yes, they can, but actually part of our humanity and the world we're born into means it probably is very difficult, but that's the point Jesus is making. It's why we need a saviour, if I can put it that way. You know, that actually it's he's not condemning about it. He's just pointing out that let's not kid ourselves that we're really good, if I can put it that way. And so there's something in us that if we kind of get high-minded and think we're just intrinsically godlike or intrinsically God-aspiring, these things will get in the way. And the tragedy after tragedy after tragedy is from kind of super formal hierarchical churches like the Catholic Church or the Orthodox, through to the most kind of intimate, friendly little chapel places and charismatic, spirit-filled places. Time and time again, we get the, if you like, the hypocrisy of preaching one thing and actually all sorts of things going on under the surface. And I think in many ways, therefore, I think what Jesus is doing is he's highlighting a need rather than actually setting. He is setting a standard, but you know what I'm saying is a standard we know we're all going to fail against. And I have no problem with I have no problem holding an ideal which is better than I am, because if it was an ideal that was as good as me, I'd be holding it for pride's sake because I've already achieved it. Does that make sense? In other words, the whole point of having a moral ideal is it ought to be ahead of you, because what it's doing is it's drawing you towards it. That's why our desires, if we're single-minded, if in the end we want to see God through everything that drags my attention, so it sucks my attention towards it, so but somehow I want to turn it in a way where I'm going to find my way through to what God's order is, and then I want to see Him. Then actually it will lead me in a way, in a fruitful kind of way, much more in a much more helpful. And sometimes the best word. I like the language of effective and ineffective, helpful, unhelpful. It will lead me rather than perfectly good and perfectly bad. It's actually these things that are leading me towards those goals, those upward goals. So Jesus, he obviously draws the focus to that private inner life again and again. Woe to you! So this isn't just a one-off, is it? You know, Jesus is regularly doing that. Woe to you, experts in the law and Pharisees! You clean the outside of the cup, but inside you're full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisees, clean the inside of the cup, so the outside might become clean too. So I read the words of Jesus not as condemnation and I write myself off because I fail, but as actually an injunction to keep my attention on those things I have real control over, not the things I can't, and to focus on those and look to kind of grow in them and so on. You kind of again, sorry, keeping that idea, is the things that come out of the mouth come out from the heart, and these things that defile the person, because out of the heart comes evil ideas, murder. So we had some of that last week. You fool, you moron. Adultery and sexual immorality, then theft, false testimony, and slander. So there's something about the heart that Jesus is pushing us towards, and something about the kind of if we don't have the challenge of an ideal that's drawing us further, once we lose that, behaviour gets worse, and that is something we do find. When people give up trying, their behaviour gets far, far worse. Yeah. So for the mouth speaks from what fills the heart. There you go, Matthew 12. You get so many of those ideas. So this isn't a brand new idea. When I say brand new idea, it's not a unique idea in Jesus' teaching. We find it fits with the other things he's saying. It's within that context. So man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. We find it in the Old Testament as well. That we're being driven towards. So back to that statement. Okay, this is where I started to move now into some of the modern study, and I kind of had to laugh a little bit when I said to Judith yesterday when I was doing the slides for this. I said, "Oh, I've just been researching pornography on the internet," and because I actually kind of I wanted to kind of see what research was out there. So she kind of raised an eyebrow at me. If you know Judith, you know how she does that. So I put that thing, going back because actually it is one of those things that particularly, and apologies to Anne and Jill here, but that it's particularly as a male issue. Is I saw someone talking on television recently. They're saying, however you look at it, he said right the way through all of history, men spend a lot of money to see naked people. That's the way he put it. And he said, I'm not saying that women don't. He said, but you don't build industries on that. He said, but there are always, every society you find there are industries based on, and so there's a kind of so there is a question, and Jesus seems to recognise it, which is why he puts it, in what I think is a more general statement about inner life, but he chooses an example which resonates very strongly, if you like, and is constantly seems to be with us because it is so foundational, as we saw going right the way back to Genesis. There is something written into our creative nature that wants to procreate, to fill up the earth with the image of God, but actually that can just become the physical side, and in particular men seem to be wired on the visual side, if I can put it that way. So I put the question, why do men and women look at sexual images? And it's an important question. I say it's an important question to ask because it can help us understand a little bit more. And as we understand a little bit deeper, we start seeing some of the complexities that Jesus is speaking into. So there was a study done in 2017, so it's not that old. And they actually kind of wired and put people in rooms where they could visually see the whole way around, and in the sake of science, got them watching things. But what was kind of really interesting as reading the results is that so they analysed both men and women individually and sometimes together, watching sexual photographs and videos, and the results that they found weren't actually what you might instantly expect. Obviously, in one sense, there is still a fruit problem, if I can put it that way, but actually some of the roots weren't exactly what you might imagine. So I hope it's okay that I'm doing this. It's very easy to avoid these kind of discussions, but the problem is the world has a big problem with it. So let's just try and understand. Let's understand this. So the thing that I thought was interesting: men looked first for the longest amount of time and most often at faces and eyes. And they did emphasise they did also look at all the intimate parts, but actually first thing and longest and drew most of their attention were people's faces and eyes. Women, and again this is science, is not being socially prejudiced or anything like that. Women who weren't, and this is an important qualification, weren't taking contraception that alters hormonal balance, so kind of, if you like, the natural makeup, looked longest and most intently at the environmental context, which can make you laugh, i.e. the quality of the sofa and the curtains. So they did know that when women were taking hormonal contraceptives, then actually they tended to go more instantly for intimate body parts, but they were as likely to be looking at the other partner, not necessarily at the man. And they tried to infer some general things from this kind of piece of research. But one of the things which is a tentative conclusion was that actually at a kind of a deep down level, part of the complex attraction, because we are going to see, obviously there's a straight physical satisfaction, or kind of a sugar rush involved with a certain amount of sexual stimulation. But at the more complex level, when you get to the more, because actually these kind of human interrelations are far more than just one thing, they're much more complicated. When you're kind of looking at that more complicated level, they're saying actually men were looking for acceptance and value. Face-to-face contact, we increasingly understand, is about value transaction. We get more value transaction when something is said to us face-to-face, and we can tie that right the way down to when a child is born, and the things that are kind of given to it are given to it by a child looking at a mother, parent looking in their face. And so we, from a very early age, learn to associate kind of value transactions with face-to-face. And so the fact that actually men's eyes are first instantly drawn to how is the person looking at them is because actually from that they're more likely to get a sense, a kind of a much more complex, wider kind of sense of acceptance and so and that women were looking for security and safety, and obviously there's obvious kind of biological reasons why that makes sense. So i.e., if this is a nice, safe looking environment, then actually that's the most important thing to understand in this kind of context. So I put, noting obviously the hormonal and mental processes involved around both sex and love, as we're going to see, are much more complicated. But it's just that kind of general sort of thing, which I did find very, I find it fascinating for lots of reasons. But one of them is that some of the more complex hormonal mixes we get as relationships go well actually make us less addictive to some of the more basic ones that drive the early stages. So, in other words, as I build an intimate physical relationship over the long term, the combination of oxytocin and serotonin that reinforces the memories that go with that. Actually, that combination makes me less susceptible to the kind of the rushes, the endorphins and the dopamines and so on, which actually do come with just the pure physical act. So, in other words, I become less addicted to that side as I grow in the quality of the longer term relationship. As we're going to look at some of those kind of things in a minute. And I think so. Seeing that idea that looking for acceptance stroke value shows how actually obviously there's something of that is part of the lack that makes the seeking after effectively the exposure of signs which visually trigger the idea of intimacy, but then they're looking to the face to see if there really is any connection. Does that make sense? So you kind of got this complex interplay of what's going on. So I really do hope, particularly for those watching on the video, that this isn't just coming across as some kind of slightly seedy kind of salacious I've done the research. But one of the troubles is I'm really fascinated by human behaviour. So and I want you. I think you can't help someone where you can, but you help them better the more you understand where people are coming from. If that makes sense. So I put perhaps it's because, as we were kind of touching on here, that both love and sex are such complex issues. Jesus doesn't turn this into a single little natty maxim. Probably because there is no single natty maxim that would ever really work, if I can put it that way. But he kind of says something in the mix which creates a direction, the kind of the seeking of God. How do I glorify and honour God in this relationship? It focuses on I've got to see something about my inner life and its insecurities and so on. And he sets a kind of a goal of being able to see God as being progress. That we're looking to see God in how we put these things, because individuals will build them in different ways. And that is quite important, because one of the things we do say. Oh yeah, okay. We've got another one on some research here. I was going to say, yeah, that's one thing, and I'm saying something quite kind and understanding after that one. But we shouldn't also forget there's an absolute massive piece of research done. Sorry, the other one was, I think, was only last year, 2018. 2017, there was a massive meta-study which encompassed 50 different pieces of scientific research, covered over 50,000 people. It was titled on the results were published: Pornography Consumption and Satisfaction, a meta-analysis, and it found, and I put there, surprise, surprise, regular consumption of pornography kills libido and causes erectile dysfunction. And this is a huge problem with the generation coming through, who are having less real. It can almost sound counter what we try and teach as Christians, but they're one level they're having less actual physical congress. But actually they're becoming actually kind of almost dysfunctional in the ability to do so. So they're losing the ability for the future because of the easy, casual online ability. And so there is a very kind of a real thing which goes beyond anything that could have been that Jesus would have known in his own day, because there's just the kind of the sheer size of the issue today was totally unknown up until this point, but the kind of the deluge level that we're hitting is actually causing huge degrees of impotence and inability long term. He's now married, but I always thought it was one of the brave things that Russell Brand said when he he made a comment when they had the red carpet treatment in London for 50 Shades of Grey film. He said, "What kind of society?" He said, just to put this in perspective, he said, "My life was ruined by early exposure to pornography. He said, I question my ability to be able to make any long-term relationship." Now, he has been married now for some years, and he speaks about the kind of, if you like, almost the healing he needed from the damage to his psyche and his inability to allow the normal place of the sexual relationship to bond a relationship with anybody, and how damaging that was. Now, the reason it's super damaging, that's why I put the Durkheim research up, is if that's the part of the foundation for building the kind of quality of relationships that make you less susceptible to suicide, what we're saying is, if you don't have those things, we're going to see increases of all those kinds of dysfunction. It's not just simply my marriage fell apart, but actually all sorts of other things flow out of it. So whereas the first one, I was taking kind of quite a compassionate view of what were people's motives. What we also have to put is a very realistic perspective into the mix, which is, that actually we have, and we work in a generation of people who are actually having their lives quite trashed. And so people do need to do something legislatively, if I can put it that way. Yeah, we'll create a sugar tax. We do need to think, how do we stop these things, because there's something in the human nature that will get drawn to it because it's easily available. See, and it ruins people. Just being really blunt. So as we kind of going on, next section of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is going to address kind of loving our neighbours and our enemies. So I thought it'd be useful in this context, though, to see this what psychology has found about the way in which, if you like, this pro-social abstracted love, kind of agape love, tends to grow out of what it is initially part of that intense, passionate, attractive, and which the philosophers run a mile from because they're scared of. Actually, we need to somehow create a kind of environment where we kind of push it in the creative, and probably there is a degree to which I would say, the church, in its own fear about addressing these things, have left people without much guidance, if I can put it that way. So somehow we need to kind of hit a kind of more mature approach, which is not what the world calls mature, which is they'll talk about anything they fancy, but one that actually is able to talk in a much more kind of rounded sense about what our physicality has been gifted to us for, and how it can produce the best results and can produce long-term satisfaction in life. And so there's a huge amount on what they refer to as love and attachment theory, which actually you find fits very nicely with their kind of Christian understanding and so on. So love and attachment are about more than just a dopamine hit, is what I put there, as we're going to see, because actually they do give you that kind of dopamine hit, which is a drug-style hit. The mean in dopamine is like the mean in amphetamine. They're not actually identical chemically, but they operate in the same cells in the body. Those two, so you get a high from amphetamine, and you also get a high from dopamine, and similar sorts of ways, if I can put it that way. So this Jesus quote on marriage. So haven't you read from the that He made them from the beginning, made them male and female? See, so let's kind of put it in proper context. God's always known; it was never a shock to Him what was going on. For this cause, a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So Jesus obviously is quoting Deuteronomy, but that phrase is actually surprisingly profound, because what we're going to see is that it's the systems within the human body which are part of the procreative and then care system that kicks in for looking after of children are actually the foundations which kind of then grow out from and actually allow us to become more loving to others, you see. So obviously, in a rather simple, obvious truism, a child who doesn't grow up in a loving home never learns to really be able to be loving elsewhere. That's a kind of a simple truism, but we're going to kind of look at it in a little bit more detail. So, and interesting though, I haven't got, I need to track it down. I didn't have time to do the slide because I've got it in a book somewhere. I just need to track it down again. But I'll refer to it because you'll see there have been, because people started to notice it, they started to design tests in surveying people, and people who end up with long-term good relationships, when you actually go through it, they've carefully constructed the questionnaires. What you actually find is all of the same positive things that have been identified in good childhood have now become attached to their partner. So so if you like, the things that were identified as being good parenting and creating a good bond, parent to child, whether it's father or the mother, actually become in the same way when you have a good long-term relationship working. You find that all of those things have now shifted to that, and that's fantastic the way God's made that, if I can put it that way. And so there's a kind of a foundation which starts, it's just about kind of procreation, and then we need care, but actually then, because we are more social as creatures, and it lasts a bit longer, so there's family relationships with it. It's that relationship and the things that go on in us that then teach us to love those who are a bit further away. They live in the same village, but they're still part of the same group, and eventually you get to the point where we're able to love the outsider even though we don't know them. But you won't love the outsider if you've not become secure and developed in that relational thing within that family context. So the leave and then cleave, which is why I highlighted those two words, is that there's something we kind of get nurtured in, and in one sense that's the generation before, expressing the positives of their physical union that hold them together, that then produce something in them that then refocuses on the child. And I don't know what it's like for other dads in the room, but for me, that was I remember when Joel was first born, it was like a switch got turned on, something changed in me. Judith had been developing that sort of same kind of sense of nurture for the last 9 months, you know. But there is something in the whole process of the family and production of the child that turns something on, and there is zero doubt in my mind. I think Judith, even though she will sometimes tell me that I never change, sorry, I'm sure that we've all been told that by our partners at some point. She would say I did become a lot more emotional in one sense. And when I say emotional, I don't mean an emotional wreck. I mean that somehow those things start to, you value them more, and you recognise them more in other people, and you start to connect.
There was a study, sorry to interrupt,
Yeah.
just highlighting what you're saying. I read it years ago, but when they showed images of babies to single men who were not fathers, their pupils didn't dilate as much.
Right, yeah.
They
That wouldn't
didn't
surprise
connect
me.
as much.
Yeah.
But when they showed it to the fathers, with a very new father or father or whatever, they basically
You're on screen.
So when they showed it to any father group, they responded in the same way. Something had switched on.
Yeah.
So from my experience, I totally understand what you're saying, because suddenly something switched on or comes into play. I don't know how you'd say it, but
it
makes a difference.
It is hormonal. I didn't put all the slides in. I thought we'd just touch them as we do. But and so you if you like, as I say, there are systems in us that start, and I'll leave it as we go just for a minute, because I think I've got some other slides which might suit it kind of better as we run through. But there's something, as we said, that the growth of, if I can put it that way, the growth of genuinely self-sacrificial love. You know, Jesus says you might lay down in your life for a friend or whatever, but would you for a stranger? Well, sometimes people do, but the growth of that out actually seems, and we can actually kind of show it in the development of things that change with certain hormones, seems to grow out of the kind of childhood experience, and then as it transitions and focuses very often initially on the partner who we're going to start to recreate a new family with as well. But often it grows out of those things. It's not saying it's exclusive, but it's the natural way in which, if you like, love kind of... so we love the Lord our God, that's the ultimate, and as we love our neighbour, as we love ourselves. So that it starts with something that at one level can be quite selfish, put it that way. That we are made in such a way that as long as we exercise our selfishness in the right way, it grows us, if I can put it that. So if we exercise our selfishness within limits, within kind of the boundaries of what God gives us, it actually kind of stretches, and eventually becomes something that becomes less selfish. So go back to the 1920s. Let's put it in this way. In the 1920s, so science was dominated by a few big ideas, two of which are the big ones. And this is why I want to get this issue of, if you like, of the instant gratification versus the longer. Two of them were Freud's psychoanalysis, and the other was John Watson's behaviourism. So, and both of those saw love as a kind of an action that was driven by reward or pleasure. So they saw the reason why. So a lot of activity and things was just about the instant reward. And so again, I'm apologising for those that get squeamish when we say these things. But so Freud saw the kind of even I find it always. Freud presents breast obsession with the fact that the young child is first nuzzled, and therefore they take the mother's milk, they get hit by a reward, which is dopamine, and they grow up therefore always obsessed with breasts. That was his kind of logic, that was his way of thinking about it. And John Watson, with his behaviourism, felt that therefore if we actually were much more careful with how we do rewards, we would change people's behaviour. I'm putting these things up there, they were both wrong, so just so we're aware. But it's helpful to kind of see the framework, to understand, because actually reward and pleasure is a part of the mix. See, and it's just, they saw it as the only thing, they saw it as the only part. And they are in the mix, if I can put it that way. Well, I have put it that way. Shouldn't be worried about that. Should be worried about the fact I just talked about male obsession with breasts and a Christian teaching evening. But
got to be real.
You've got to be real. So both were wrong in their because and what they're wrong in was they're nothing buttery. I.e., it's nothing but that. It's nothing but, because there is a dopamine hit, and there is a kind of reward, and there is a kind of a pleasure type thing. But this is what I mean by the selfishness done in the right way actually stretches you in ways you perhaps didn't intend it to, but it does, and actually widens our perspective and our kind of well-being and well-intention towards others. So, as I say, it turns out the reward and pleasure is entangled with attachment and in the building of partnership love, which is good for both parties, and then out of that we find the wider sense to grow. So hopefully this is all kind of interesting. So there you go, that's John Watson. So he says, men are built, not born. Give me a baby and I'll make it climb and use hands in constructing and building of stones or wood. I'll make it a thief, a gunman. In other words, he's saying, it's just whatever I reward them for is what they'll do. And I hope you don't mind, I put no shoopy doopy doop Sherlock, just because John Watson, of course, was Sherlock, and that little expression. He was incorrect, though. He was incorrect. At the same time, he was teaching that, but that became really popular, if you remember, around the war and after the war, and it stood behind the whole issue of leaving babies to cry in cots. All of that was because we reward them for the wrong things. You see. So if you want them to behave in a good civilised way, we're going to only reward them when we do the things that society wants from them, you see. And that whole way of thinking, which now at the same time working for totally different reasons with monkeys. Here we go, here's Harry Harlow. He was having to breed rhesus monkeys for research in other things, and he noticed in the thing that actually they would just die very quickly without a mother. But they didn't always have mothers available, so he took on the initial theory, which is that actually all they really needed is reward, and he kind of he had a kind of a dispensing thing with a bottle of milk that but actually what he found they needed was a soft, cuddly monkey mother, and so he started putting these kind of cloth mothers, as they referred to, which felt like mothers and were warm and cuddly and snuggly. And one of the things that they found, you see, was that even if there was a feeding tube, you see the kind of feeding tube over there, is that actually and these were still, just to make it real, the cloth mother didn't really replace the mother, but it was better than nothing, if I can put it that way. So now we understand that these were still slightly disturbed rhesus monkeys without the loss of the mother. And what he realised was there was another system going on. So we knew about the reward system, which is what stood behind Freud and his kind of psychoanalysis and was behind behaviourism. But actually was a basic, and his work was the foundation of attachment theory, which is that actually for our well-being we need to be connected to other people, and it starts with the mother. And as we've kind of explored it over the years, and we look at what goes on hormonally, and actually we've said that something does happen in fathers who are wired in the right way, is that as we start having children, then it does start kicking in what they sometimes now refer to as the care system, you see. And the care system is driven by a similar hormone to the things that draw us together in the first place, which is the oxytocin, which are they're not addictive. They make us feel good, but they're not addictive like dopamine. And dopamine and other things that go within, well, we'll think about them when we look at intense love, the early phases of love. We need them, but they are kind of consumables. they're here today and they're gone tomorrow. They don't have a long-lasting effect. Whereas the way we make memories, which we use serotonin for, and oxytocin is involved in the mix, leave us with much greater sense of long-term well-being. And oxytocin is the hormone that makes a mother want to have children. It's been studied. If you look in lobsters, I think I've mentioned this before. Have I told this story about the lobsters? Okay, the lobster equivalent of oxytocin is isotocin. The lobsters are vicious creatures. They will snip each other up, if they can. So if you ever go into a lobster restaurant, you'll see they're all in the same tank, kind of being peaceful, but they're not feeling peaceful. They've just got rubber bands around their claws. What they're thinking is, I want to cut you up, mate. and that would be true. Male lobsters to female lobsters, and they're bigger. See, so that's a problem for when you want to have children. So what happens is that the female, sorry, I'm keeping on the time. The female zooms towards the biggest lobster, who's the most desirable lobster. He has the big, easy to defend lair. She has to rush up to it, and she basically squirts the oxytocin, or the lobster equivalent, which is called isotocin, into the thing, and it changes his whole attitude. And suddenly he becomes kind of, well, hey. At which point it's safe for her to go into the lair, and she has to become very vulnerable because she has to lose her shell for them then and to lay eggs. And during that whole period, he's got this really good attitude towards her. He'll be protective of her and so on and so forth. And so at the very basic kind of level, oxytocin helps us kind of create the bond that allows reproduction. But then in the mother, it becomes part of the bond that produces the child. And actually men produce it as well, and actually some of the experience of the birth and so on raises their oxytocin level. So we have what those often refer to as the love hormone, which is making us feel more generally well disposed to people. And it's the foundation of the growth of that and the processing of things into the kind of history and memories that actually allow us to start to genuinely feel, not just doing it because we ought to do it, to genuinely do things which are not good for us at all, but even for total strangers, if I can put it that way. So we kind of understand now the sort of the cycle. At one level, it starts with something selfish because we get a bit of a hit and a high from the sort of the sexual union. It's got all sorts of other things with it. But actually, in the process of doing it, and as we say, if we don't do it in a way that just gets us addicted to it, we actually do it in a way that builds towards the memories. We start to embed into us a better nature. So actually, family life is not just good because we reproduce the next generation, but it also makes for a better society. Now, obviously there are people like Jesus who's never married. It's not the only way you get there, because actually we're very complex, but it's the normal way in which pro-social behaviour is nurtured well. Does that make sense? And so therefore it's very important, and it comes back to, we'll go back. So I should say, so out of attachment, one of the things they notice is these kind of key dimensions of proximity maintenance. The child strives to be near the parent. There's separation distress. They exhibit more anxiety. They feel more anxiety when distant. There's a safe haven. They draw comfort from the parent when distressed, and a secure base. All those little things that are there, and there's some other stuff as well. These are what they notice actually happens where there is a good, secure kind of relationship. Is that even with people who cope with it, just as like a secure child can cope with it when his parent's not there, but when they measure it, what you're seeing is they're more susceptible to stress. And actually where you have a good marriage, although they're quite happy to be apart, very often they say that's part of it, but actually when you measure it, they are more susceptible when they're not together. So being together is something that actually we see as a dynamic that's going on initially from parent to child, but of course eventually your parents won't be there, so you're finding another partner. Eventually they become and they play within, if you like, the more complicated care system that makes up the human person. They become a key part of that. They end up taking up all of those kind of roles. There's not just these. There's some other things as well, but that have been kind of studied and put together in these ways. He also kind of had some. He looked at different strategies that people have, that babies develop, and you find the same things. Actually, one of the things that's interesting is the strategies we develop as children. And this has been around for 50, 60 years, and it's still recognised. In other words, it's not one of those ideas that came and then was proved wrong. It stuck. Which is, he identified very quickly, particularly through his research assistant, the lady Mary Ainsworth, that actually fundamentally infants on the whole develop kind of three styles of attachment with a parent, and what you find is that they exhibit the same when they get into later adult life, and they can all be kind of, one is the kind of the best one obviously, but so in the secure, about 66% of people who have kind of fit into this, what I've got there, they can move. Sorry, got to go, let's take a step back. When I was talking about relationships, it's that one of the things is when it works well, it allows us to behave differently even when we're not with the parent as when we are. And in his what he calls secure attachment is even when the parent's not there, they can move easily and quickly between, and they can explore without the parent, but they also want to reaffirm the connection when the parent comes back. So it kind of works, but and that's what I'm saying you can have in a healthy relationship. You don't have to be together the whole time, but actually there's a bit more strain, and when you're together, therefore you tend to reaffirm the relationship so that you're better equipped to go away the next time, and so on. The insecure will actually kind of exhibit more obviously anxiety when the parent's absent, and therefore they will find other means of feeling secure to explore, and then they will moderate their attachment when the parent is present. And that's a very good example, probably, or a driver for understanding, if you like, the reasons why people play away from home, is the phrase that's used, or will kind of get drawn in towards the use of pornography and other things. Is actually a kind of a type of thing that goes within insecure attachment, because they find ways of managing it so that because they're not really secure in the stability of the relationship that they have. Is that making sense? The insecure one.
I know we talk about broken homes and when couples separate.
Yeah.
and
so you
causes
can't.
Sets up that.
Yeah. So
insecurity and.
So what it's saying is that the deeper care system, you can't guarantee you'll get that level of satisfaction from this relationship, so it becomes reduced a bit more to the instant kind of pleasure cycle. And then the insecure resistance, that's insecure avoiding, insecure resistant, is that they become very demanding and clingy, and they won't explore anywhere else until the other person comes back. So we also see that's the smallest percentage, but you see those kind of things, and that happens and therefore becomes the foundations very often of the relationships that we go into as adults, because modern life can sometimes have created those situations. It wasn't a bad choice by a parent, it's just the way things kind of go. What's love got to do with it? Yeah, so okay, I wanted to put that love is a social construct, but I put there, so is death, but that doesn't mean people don't really die. The reason I'm saying that is you regularly hear this phrase thrown around the place. Gender's just a social construct, okay? It is true, gender is a social construct. Sex, your physical sex is not a social construct, but gender is. But the point is, it doesn't have no connection with reality at all. That's where people get it wrong. The reason I put that there is that different cultures in different ways will express love differently. There are kids going off to university who will go on in English lectures and history lectures where they'll tell you, love as we kind of think of it didn't really exist until 400 years ago. You see, now what they mean by that is that there's a kind of a Western developed sort of way of understanding love and how it fits together. Now, that is because love is complicated. That's why that's what it's not quite like fear, which you can kind of instantly track. Kind of the sympathetic nerve is suddenly on one side, and we're kind of in fear, fight, and flight mode. If you see what I mean, love is much more complex than that. It's layer after layer after layer, and some of those layers we have learned from our parents, and we've learned to interpret, and so on. So it is a social construct. It belongs at the level of how we interact in our current society. But just as the way when we die is also a social construct, and the way we imagine it and think about it, but people still die every year. So people still fall in love, if I can put it that way. So there are foundational things and there are social aspects. And the fact that there are some aspects which are unique to our culture, it would be different if we were in India, they would be different if we lived 2,000 years ago, but there are also some things that pretty much are the same.
It's interesting you say that about India, because I'm just thinking of that arranged marriage building block, because you don't have all the romantic sort of side officially. Yeah. Certainly a traditional society, so that has to be done once
Yeah.
marriage starts.
And it's a good example of what I mean by, so there's a certain element to how we understand love, which is defined by our culture, is all we're really saying. But that doesn't mean to say there isn't something at a genuine physical, humanity, biological level kind of going on. Don't worry, we're nearly through. I told you I had a lot of slides for tonight. So romantic love is even more so than just love. But there are two underlying effects which are as real as death, and we can actually kind of see these, and that I refer to them as there is, if you like, the reward side, and there is the care side. There is there's an attachment and there's a kind of care. So the passionate love is similar in its effects to the highs of heroin and cocaine, and it's very addictive. It produces chemical effects in the body that are very similar to those things. And compassionate love, I put there, is the high point of serotonin-enhanced oxytocin built into connection. You'll get used to my way of talking as we keep doing these. Is that Aristotle, looking at happiness, identified that there were two types of happiness. And there's one that you feel instantly because things go well, and it's not just physical touch produces it. If something goes, if I won the lottery, I might get a bit of a buzz. If something, they don't have to be physical. They can be all sorts of, but they produce an instant high, and he called that hedonic happiness. And there were some that aren't like that, but they seem to work better for the long term, and he called that eudaimonic, which means good-spirited happiness. And in many ways, what we're doing here is either side of that. That passionate love it feeds the instant. It feels good in the moment. It can become very addictive. It is actually good for us. It deals with stress. It does all sorts of things. The longer term, which I put compassionate love, as we'll think about these in a second, actually requires a process of reflection in the context of having experienced the good things and so on. And sometimes even the good things aren't necessarily good, but as we reflect on them, and serotonin actually solidifies memories and it changes the way we see the world. So they're often good with hindsight, if I can put it that way. And so in the early days of happiness tests, having children, they couldn't work out. Some said having children made you happy, and some said it didn't make you happy. And that depends which you're measuring. Because if you're looking at hedonic happiness, which passionate love is part of, it doesn't make you so happy having children, because there's less time to have fun. And you're having to spend money on kind of children's nappies instead of going on such a nice holiday, you see. So that kind of happiness goes down, and it doesn't happen with everybody. If you reflect on the experiences of family life, in the long term, it produces a lot of eudaimonic happiness, you see. And so depending on how you ask the question, it could make you happy or not. Does that make sense? I don't want to get too much into that because it's a slightly different subject, but actually, in this complex thing, with all of the different layers that go on in love, we do have an element which is very much driven by the here and now and can be quite addictive. So in the tension of what Jesus is talking about, when he says, if you're looking for lust, it's actually feeding that. It's feeding that element. Does that make sense? And so as we kind of tease out, what we're saying is that actually a mature approach to our physicality and our love is to learn how to balance the need for that, because it has certain elements, but to recognise its addictive nature and its non-sustainability, as we're going to see, because all things that are addictive become non-sustainable. It's the flip side of them. It's why drug addicts have to take more of the same drug and have to take it more regularly, and when they get it, it doesn't have the same effect on them. So they need it more, but when they have it, it doesn't have the same high. That makes sense. I've taken these from one of the guys I've read quite a few of his books, John Haidt. He does a kind of a meta-analysis of, and he's saying over a 6-month period, if you kind of track companionate love, which is coming therefore very often by the way you build the memories and you process them and they become part of you, over a 6-month period, the passionate seems to totally dominate. So the beginnings of a relationship, so you put all these highs, those danger points, I won't go into it, he says it's often where relationships go wrong, so those kind of these points, it's been sort of studied. The key thing I just wanted to get was that kind of slow rise, whereas you got the instant hit. But that's the kind of the cocaine type style of hit, and it feels very heady and addictive, and people do rash, stupid things. Romeo and Juliet would never have been a play if there was no such thing as passionate love. It's very real. People do experience it. it's not purely about physical satisfaction. There's something in the whole thing that makes us so excited, and we take risks and go overboard and so on. But in the long term, so that's a 6-month period, as you put it, what happens is, on the whole, compassionate love keeps on and on growing right to old age, whereas in actual fact the intensity of the passionate kind of drops, and actually it becomes quite manageable. As the thing is often said, to use the drug addiction kind of thing, is if you only have cocaine once a month, you'll get a high from it and you'll never get addicted, you see, and it will feel as good the next time. Now, I'm not suggesting that's the good thing to do, I'm just saying it's the nature of highs. The problem is when you have it, you move to having it every 2 weeks, and then you get a bit, I need it a bit more now, so I now go to once every 10 days, and then it becomes once every week, and by the time it's happening to every day, I'm not even getting the same high from it. And that is effectively what is happening with the kind of, where people are feeding a sort of the instant gratification within their kind of, if you like, what the systems that are put in their bodies that should be there to be building this relationship and connection, which produces family and produces the history that produces companionate love. And you put that little phrase there, and you suddenly think of that verse, don't you, in Genesis 2. It's not good for someone to be on their own. This is the slow, long-term well-being. I'll come in a second, but how I was going to say, because I'm nearly finished, but I'm on my downward. Because actually the companionate love is part of the as I say, what they call the eudaimonic happiness system. Eudaimonic happiness system, which is part of the well-being stuff we looked at a few weeks ago, actually means you'll have less cancer, less diabetes, less dementia. It is really, really good for you. So actually you will live longer if you have a good companionate partner. Actually the passion side of it kind of drives you through some of the inconveniences of actually that kids are an inconvenience, but oh dear, we've actually had one now, so we've got to make do and get on with it, and that produces the longer term good and the well-being. So drawing it right back again, is that putting it back. Jesus makes this thing, desire of God. There's something good that grows out of us when we're doing it well. But there are things that we can do, and it's not just necessarily the one thing, but if we make it about just what feeds the physically pleasurable, however those things are, we risk undermining the ability to build the other. I mean, it's a proper part of it, and it has its place, and so on. So I love this. I really like this as one of my, because there's so much I'm discovering in kind of modern psychology that fit this verse. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And part of that whole building, the way we build the companionate side, is part of the process, which is often to do with what we invest into. We invest emotionally and so on. And Jesus puts it that way: is what you're investing into, what you put your resources into, where your treasure is. Actually, they become part of what really matters to us in terms of our heart. So it's your heart is joined to what you invest into, which is why people get more out of marriages than when they cohabit for 40 years, because they have never gone through a process which we can kind of demonstrate of kind of finally restricting, which is when you do that final restriction, you get more out of it than when you've always keeping your options open. So in other words, you can say, oh, we'll try it for the next 40 years. You'll never discover whether it's going to be as good or not until you actually say, we're not going to keep trying it, we've actually got to do it now. When you make that decision, suddenly you get more meaning from them. So the things that you restrict yourself to, and that's not just in relationships, but in all sorts of things like career choice, it even comes through in like choosing a football team. The fact that, hey, I can enjoy all sorts of football teams, which I've done because we travelled all over the place, so everybody supports someone different. So I kind of, Judy laughs, I like to watch a bit of a match of the day, but I watch the football, not the team, if that makes sense. But I don't get as much out of it as those that have invested and bought the club T-shirts and go every week. They get a lot more meaning from it. It's just the way it works.
Heavily invested.
When you invest into it, you get more from it, and that's true of our relationships as well, which is why marriage is so key. So I think we're pretty much there. There is a final video, but I don't think we necessarily need to watch it, which is about attachment theory and how that turns to adults. But we probably, look, it's 5 to 9. Oh, is it only 5 to 9?
Yeah.
Put the link on the app.
Okay, we can watch it. We can watch it. Okay, do you want to watch it? is what I was saying about how attachment moves from children to adults. So here we go. Nope, I've gone backwards. Oh, it looks like I'm going to have to... Oh, it's not playing. Oh well, maybe it's not properly embedded. Oh, yes it is. Going now. But of course,
No sound.
no sound. Hang on.
Or seemingly intractable, miserable conflicts
There we
running
go.
through them. It's one of the biggest questions there is. Why is it so hard to be happy in love? The huge and not yet fully digested insight of psychoanalysis is that the challenges of relationships always start when we were children. It was the contribution of a great English psychoanalyst called John Bowlby to trace the tensions and conflicts we have with our partners back to our earliest experiences of maternal care. His ideas are sound in part because he drew so deeply and honestly on his own experiences in order to formulate them. Born in 1907, Bowlby had a quintessentially upper-class British childhood. Young Bowlby hardly saw his parents and was looked after by a nanny who was let go when he was just 4, leaving young Bowlby bereft. At 7 he was sent off, in line with the conventions of his class, to boarding school. He hated it and later declared, "I wouldn't send a dog away to boarding school at the age of 7. Bowlby became a brilliant medical student and an imaginative researcher. When he was a consultant to the World Health Organization in the early 1950s, Bowlby wrote a report, Maternal Care and Mental Health. He attacked prevalent assumptions and argued that kindness doesn't smother and spoil children. It's as if maternal care were as necessary for the proper development of personality as vitamin D for the proper development of bones, he wrote. This insight initiated a wave of reform. The visitation rules of many health institutions were reformed to allow parents to stay with their children, where they'd once been allowed only to visit and never touch. It sounds like a dry, bureaucratic move, but it ended countless afternoons of quiet sorrow and evenings of solitary anguish. In a book published in 1959 called Separation Anxiety, Bowlby looks at what happens when there isn't enough of this kind of parental care. He described the behaviour of children he'd observed who'd been separated from their parents. If the child is separated for too long, they still crave the attention, love and interest of the parents, but feel that anything good may disappear at any moment. They look for a lot of reassurance and get upset if it's not forthcoming. They become volatile, they take heart and then they despair, and then they're filled with hope again. This is the pattern of what Bowlby called anxious attachment. But the degree of separation from the parents may lead to another sort of problem. The child could feel so helpless, they become what Bowlby called detached. They enter their own world to protect themselves and become remote and cold. They experience what Bowlby calls avoidant attachment. That is, they see tenderness, closeness, emotional investment as always dangerous and to be shunned. They may in truth be desperate for a cuddle or for reassurance, but such things look far too treacherous. The focus of Bowlby's thinking was about what happens to a child if there are too many difficulties in forming secure attachments. But the consequences don't magically get restricted only to the age of 8 or 12 or 17. They're lifelong. Our attachment style is fed by our earliest experiences. It's a pre-existing script that gets written into our adult relationships, usually without us even realizing that this has happened. In line with Bowlby's views about how children relate to their parents, there are 3 basic kinds of attachment we can have to other adults. Firstly, secure attachment. This is the rare ideal. When you're securely attached, if there's a problem, you'll work it out. You're not appalled by the weakness of your partner. If your partner's a bit down, confused, or being a bit annoying, you don't react too wildly, because even if they can't be nice to you, you can take care of yourself and have hopefully a little time left over to meet some of the needs of your partner. You give the other the benefit of the doubt when interpreting behaviour. You realise that maybe they had a tricky time at work, that's why they're not so interested in your day. The explanations are accommodating, generous, and usually more accurate. But there's another kind of attachment, anxious attachment, and this is marked by clinginess, texting and calling all the time just to check where the other is and keep tabs on what they're up to. You need to make sure the other person hasn't left you or the country. Anxiously attached people become coercive and demanding and focus on their own needs, not their partner's. Anxious attachment involves a lot of anger because the stakes feel so high. A minor slight, a hasty word, a tiny oversight can look to the anxiously attached person like huge threats. They seem to announce the imminent breakup of the whole relationship. One feels the reason you don't tell me that the minestrone soup I made is delicious is that you don't love me and are planning to leave me, when the true explanation may simply be that one's partner is mulling over a very tricky bit of news about a contract at work. Avoidant attachment means that you would rather withdraw and go away than compromise, get angry, or even just get close to another person. If there's a problem, you don't talk. Your instinct is to say you don't need the other person, especially if you're lonely. Avoidant spouses often team up with anxious ones. It's a risky combination. The avoidant one doesn't give the anxious one much support, and the anxious one is always invading the delicate privacy of the avoidant one. Bowlby helps us to feel more generous and more constructive about what these partners are doing when they upset or disappoint us. Almost no one in truth is purely anxious or purely avoidant. We're just a bit like that some of the time. So, alerted by Bowlby, we can see that a partner's apparent coldness and indifference is not caused by their loathing of us, but by the fact that a long time ago they were probably rather badly hurt by intimacy. And it opens possibilities of self-knowledge which can help one reform, if only a little, one's own rather eccentric behaviour.
So I'm very conscious. It's not exactly what we were looking at today, but I used it because it's illustrative of that thing which I wanted to get across, which is that actually the whole foundational kind of procreative relationship, the having of children, the nurturing of children, actually you can see how it actually spins out. And although what I was citing goes beyond what was done there, if you go back, because this is some long-standing research, but it's been kind of explored time and time again as the way actually this bigger and bigger and better and more, if you like, abstracted sense of kind of agape love actually grows out of, it comes easier out of where we have those kind of secure kind of familial relationships, so it does become kind of relevant. So good. So well, that's probably that's kind of come to the end. The trouble when you do stuff that's too driven by a PowerPoint is you kind of don't kind of have that nice general flow down. It's suddenly will hit the last slide, so we just finished. But does anyone here want to ask a question? Obviously those watching can't, but